BBC is to get tougher scrutiny on their online content over concerns about bias within the organisation. That's according to Lucy Fraser, who has said audiences think the corporation is not sufficiently impartial.
Yes, the Culture Secretary was also asked about GB News, interestingly, during her appearance on BBC Radio 4 this morning.
Let's turn to another part of the broadcasting landscape, which is GB News. While loss-making, GB News has built a significant following both on linear TV and online. Would you agree with the assertion that it has transformed our broadcasting landscape?
I'm in favour of media plurality, and what that means is that there's a wide variety of views across out there for people to watch and listen to, so that audiences can find the views that they want to hear. And GB News is an important part of that landscape. It's decided to be regulated by Ofcom, as indeed many other broadcasters have, but I think it's really important that we have that variety of views.
Right, well, there you go, being asked about GB News, whether it's transformed the media landscape. Yeah,
I liked that snide comment there about loss-making, quote-unquote. Well, unfortunately, Amal, we're not all funded by a pretty much forced tax, where if you don't pay, you get banged up in prison. And
you told me earlier, 400,000 fewer people bought the BBC licence fee last year. Yeah. That's a huge drop, significant amount of money lost there. Shall we speak to the former BBC reporter and presenter, Danny Kelly? Danny, thank you very much for coming on the show. You worked at the BBC before. Do you think they've got it wrong when it comes to impartiality?
Well, you know, Ben just hit the nail on the head. You know, he couldn't help but be biased, even with the introduction of GB News, and he had to crowbar loss-making in. And that's typical of the BBC. I spent 18 years at the BBC on a regional level, and I learned pretty early on about the groupthink and worldview on things. I remember West Midlands Police issued a press release 20 years ago in Coventry, and they were looking for two black guys who had committed a street robbery. I was writing up the report, and I was told to remove the word black from the report because it was racist. And that's symptomatic with management and journalists at the BBC.
That's very interesting.
Are they biased? I would say yes, they are biased, yeah.
That's very interesting. Do you think any improvements have been made? Because this isn't new, accusations of bias, and some work has been put in, hasn't there?
Yeah, I think now if West Midlands Police were looking for two street robbers who were black, they'd include the word black. I definitely think that there has been improvement. But if you remember, Emily and Ben, the bottleneck of Brexit, trying to get Brexit through Parliament, a frustrated Parliament, and when Boris Johnson called a snap general election, I remember driving in. I used to host a mid-morning phone, and we went on air at 9 o'clock. And I would drive into Birmingham and listening to our 8 a.m. breakfast show news bulletin, and it was basically anti-Brexit, which is okay, so long as you give another opinion, a balanced opinion. So the CBI in charge of business would say, I'm just making something up on the spot, would say the world would stop spinning if we left without a deal, and that would be the end of it. There would never be but Nigel Farage says the earth will not stop spinning if we leave without a deal. And that was commonplace. And the problem, in my opinion, is that the management have this very left-leaning view, and it's almost an abuse of power, because the BBC should be very balanced. And I found that the newsroom staff full of lefties and liberal remainers, they would be in charge of output, and they took that power, and it would be what they wanted them to hear if they were driving through Birmingham. And the audience, of course, were working-class Brexit voters. And that's one of the reasons why people have abandoned local radio, because it's just a complete disconnect. And are the BBC biased? There are lots of examples where the BBC regionally would take any opportunity to give Brexit a bad name. Boris Johnson management absolutely loathed it, and any opportunity to bash Boris Johnson's commonplace.
Well, Danny, I mentioned a bit earlier in the show about the infamous freedom of information request from a few years back about the number of newspapers and the different titles purchased by the BBC to stock in their different buildings and studios. The Guardian, of course, was number one. The BBC frequently bought massive loads of copies of The Guardian ahead of any other nightspapers. But just playing devil's advocate, Danny, Remainers would say that the BBC is heavily in favour of Brexit. For example, Nigel Farage has appeared on Question Time. They'd argue more than any other any other politician or pro-Brexit character. What would you say to that?
As well, all wish them.
Well, I would argue that if they're going to have any sort of balance on Question Time, they're going to want someone who's a heavyweight politician and who better than Nigel Farage. He's charismatic, he talks a great deal of sense, and he can hold his own in an argument. So it's not a case of too much Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage just represents one side of the argument. And if I was booking a panel on Question Time, I'd book Nigel Farage.
Yeah, well, also, isn't it interesting that they can't think of any other Brexiteers? It's not just Nigel Farage who represents Brexit leaving the European Union. Danny, just lastly, can you explain to our viewers how the way the BBC is regulated by Ofcom is different from other broadcasters? The accusation that they mark their own homework.
Well, it's my understanding, Emily, that it's all done in-house, if you like, and there's probably a team of mandarins at the BBC who will address any concerns that Ofcom may have, and then it's all very closely knit. It's great to see, Emily and Ben, that Ofcom are now going to pay attention to their output on social media. I'll leave you with just one great example of social media and BBC bias. My ex-boss at the BBC loathed Boris Johnson, and I remember she came in one morning to take a photograph of all the front pages of the tabloids, and Boris Johnson was getting a kicking. Every front page of every tabloid had a picture of Johnson, and it was all very negative. And there was a montage, and it was tweeted. And I found that very interesting because I wondered whether that was a daily thing, whether every day the station took photographs of the front pages. So I went back to the day before's Twitter feed. No montage of any front pages. The day before that, no montage of any front pages. It was quite simply used as an opportunity to bash Boris Johnson. And that's a social media thing that maybe Ofcom would pay attention to.
And it's interesting, this idea of groupthink at the BBC. It's not something that's confined just to the BBC. It's a lot of our institutions, I think, and also some of our big corporates too, sort of towing the line, not much room for...
But do you know what? I'm being generous here. I don't even think it's intentional.
No.
I just think they're so cocooned in their own bubble, their own sort of metropolitan elite bubble, that they just think that's how the rest of the world think and that's how the rest of society must think. I don't think these people really... They might think they're cultured, going on ski holidays and whatever else, but they're not really cultured in terms of Britain. I mean, look at the polls ahead of Brexit and the way BBC covered the Brexit vote. They thought Remain was nailed on. But Danny Kelly, thank you so much, former BBC reporter.
Okay.
Joining us there for your expertise and analysis.
Interesting, yes. Let us know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.com.